welcome to another episode of The Man from Hildebrand. I'm in a slightly different location. This is the lounge of my house, and I've specifically chosen this room to do this episode because I'm going to be talking a little bit about the literature Bond. And as you can see behind me, I have the collection of folio societies and other paperback editions as well, which I'm not too sure if you can see from there. So yes, in the last episode I promised I would talk a bit about the literature Bond, and that is what I'm going to do. So I'm kind of going to sort of give my views on what I feel that us Bond fans really want from Ian Fleming publications. Now obviously they have sort of released, apart from Charlie Hickson's On His Majesty's Secret Service and Raymond Benson's The Eye and the Hook, I don't think they've actually released anything that appeals to us hardcore Bond fans. Yes, I'm sure there's people out there who have pre-ordered Quantum of Menace, the first in the Q Mysteries series. That I kind of expressed my thoughts on that a while back, and obviously with a recent announcement of the James Bond and the Secret Agent Academy. Yeah, I kind of get why they're doing it, to kind of tap into a different sort of age range. I get that, but it's not really what us hardcore Bond fans want. Now, I think I'm probably pretty much got it nailed on the head with what I'm about to say. So 2005, Charlie Hickson came along and blew our fucking minds apart. He basically gave us a series of 5 novels, which was the Young Bond series. Yes, when this was first announced in 2004, I was very sceptical because I knew Charlie Hickson purely from the Fast Show, and for him to be one of the writers and the producers in at the time, the recent reboot of Ranelagh Knobkirk Deceased with Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer, which I absolutely loved. Plus David Arnold did the music for it. So that's how I was familiar with Charlie Hickson. I kind of thought, okay, he's going to be doing this sort of Young Bond series, which is going to be very much like Harry Potter. At the time, I wasn't a massive fan of Harry Potter, so I was very sceptical. However, I went and, when Silverfin was released, I read it within a weekend. It was absolutely fantastic. And the books that followed were absolutely brilliant. And it's always interesting because what's never really often mentioned is that his 5 novels are actually kind of sort of a mirror image of the first 5 Fleming novels. Silverfin, it opens with a line, something about, it's basically like the scent and the sweat is irritating in a school corridor. It was basically mirroring the opening line to Casino Royale. Blood Fever, it was set in the Caribbean. It involved pirates' treasure. Live and Let Die, Caribbean, pirates' treasure. Double or Die, it was set entirely in the United Kingdom. I think there was a car chase where Bond was in his uncle's Aston Martin. Moonraker, entirely set in UK. There's a car chase, of course, between Bond's Bentley and Drax's Mercedes. Hurricane Gold, there was a character in that, the girl called Precious Stone. The Precious Stone, is that not a diamond? Diamonds are forever. By Royal Command, that, I think, memory serves me, it kind of involved the Soviets and Russia, From Russia with Love. So yeah, those 5 Hickson books cleverly mirrored the first 5 Fleming novels. And yeah, I mean, to this day, I would absolutely love to, for them to be all adapted into sort of an animated films, I mean, basically, you get to buy Royal Command, you have literally kind of got sort of the answers which Fleming teased us in Bond's obituary, which can be read in You Only Live Twice. There's obviously the incident with the maid. Now, with Fleming being Fleming, Bond being Bond, we assumed it, might have involved some sort of sexual act. Obviously, Higson had to kind of change that, much to probably many of our disappointments, because it was aimed at kids. So I think he then basically involved, I think the maid was like a traitor or a spy or something. So that's where the incident with the maid comes from. So yeah, Charlie Higson, he absolutely, totally, in my opinion, revolutionised the Bond canon, because this was the first time we'd gone back. It was set in 1930s. It was just absolutely brilliant series, and yeah, I do need to actually revisit that series again. Absolutely fantastic. Years later, Steve Cole came along and gave us 4 books. This was Bond several years after Higson's series. Bond had just gone to Fettes in Edinburgh, and I personally can't really get into the Cole books as much as I did with Higson. Higson, I really enjoyed. Cole's, I just didn't quite get it. Even though I do think Strike Lightning is probably my favourite of the Cole books. Red Nemesis, which was his last one, that was okay. That kind of sort of explored the death of his death of his parents more, which I kind of always think is interesting. So yeah, and then obviously, after Cole had gone, I think a lot of us was sort of expecting novels to be kind of set during the war, set during Bond's time during the war, before he was in the service, when he was in the Navy. We was expecting that. Unfortunately, that hasn't come. Now, the thing with... Now, I like to make these videos as realistic as possible. Now, the chances of it happening are probably zilch, because IFP have probably got their own different ideas. But Dynamite Comics, they did a couple of volumes, which was James Bond Origins, which basically explored Bond's kind of adventures during the war. I feel that, you could have a decade's worth set. I don't know, you could have 5 or 10 novels set in the 1940s exploring Bond's past, in the war. And I think that the person who could be perfect for that is none other than Mr. Robert Harris. Now, not only was he born just down the road from me, but I just think, I've only actually ever read 2 of his books, and I've thoroughly enjoyed them. I mean, a lot of his books have now been adapted to films and TV. He did Enigma, which obviously became the 2001 film with Kate Winslet and Doug Ray Scott, with a brilliant score by John Barry. His recent one, Conclave, about the Pope. He did Archangel, which was adapted into a TV series back in 2005, starring none other than Mr. Daniel Craig. So he has done a huge range of books, and he's done a lot set during the war. Enigma is one of them. Now, the very first book I'd read of his was actually V2. And about 2 years ago now, me and the wife, we went to our spiritual home of Mallorca, and I can remember I ran out of reading material, and this V2 was just on the bookcase. I thought, oh, I'll read that. And it was on a Sunday, and it was the first time I ever finished a book in one sitting. I mean, this book was probably about 300 pages long, and it was from 8 o'clock in the morning through about 5:30 at night, and I was just sat on the sunbed, few pints of, drinking a few pints next to the pool in the sun. Absolutely lush, and God, I'm so wanted to go back there. I really am. But yeah, so V2, it was absolutely fantastic. So I'm thinking, you know what, Robert Harris, why has he not been approached? I believe Lee Child may have been approached to do Bond, but I think he may have turned it down. So it's not like you know, they're not sort of avoiding big names. But yeah, I feel that Robert Harris would do quite a good job in bringing Bond through the war, because he's obviously had a lot of experience writing about the war. And briefly, I mean, the second book I read of Harris's was Fatherland, which was actually his first novel he'd written. And to say that was his first novel he'd written, it was quite a very original kind of concept, and it was basically like an alternative universe on, you know, set in Berlin, 1964. Hitler has survived. He was celebrating his 75th birthday. Queen Elizabeth had moved to Canada. Winston Churchill had moved to Canada. They'd come to an agreement with Great Britain and America, and basically he still kind of had all of the continent, and Berlin was like his kind of sort of hometown. And obviously, I think during the war, I can't remember what it was, but he had an architect who basically designed Berlin, which is like a great big sort of palace, if you like, if Hitler, you know, survived. And it was all written and based on that. And yeah, so Fatherland, really good book. So I think for Bond stories to be set in the 1940s is something that IFP need to go for, because I know that that's going to go down so much better with us older fans than Quantum of Menace, the Q Mysteries, or the you know, the Secret Agent Academy. You know, we don't need that. Yes, okay, you're doing it to, you know, bring in new audiences. I get that, but you need to keep us at art. You know, you need, you know, if it wasn't for us, you probably wouldn't be where you are now. And obviously, you know, Mr. Fleming, he, you know, if it wasn't for him writing Bond, Casino Royale, none of us would be here now. So he's written that. He's obviously got this huge fan base, which needs to be respected. So you've got Bond in the 40s, and then he kind of finishes off, you know, the last novel of the 40s could then tie into Horowitz's Forever and a Day. And then you go into the 50s, 60s. Now, several years ago, there's a gentleman on Hildebrand, Mr. Daniel Kahn, and he's recently got himself a dog, so congratulations on that. That'll probably be the best thing you'll ever do. I was never a dog person, but the missus insisted we got a dog. I says, okay, you can get a dog providing it's a nice, calm, chill dog, so she gets a Cocker Spaniel. Thankfully, that Cocker Spaniel is the most chilled out, loving dog you could ever wish for. So yes, well done on getting a dog, and you will love every minute of it. But anyway, Daniel Kahn, several years ago, made this absolutely brilliant suggestion, which I will never forget, and I will always remember him for the suggestion, which he says, you know, why not have again 10 novels where, you know, set in the 1970s, because the 70s is a decade which Bond has not been in, and there is so much going on. I mean, you've got the Vietnam War, you've got still Space Race, you've got the Watergate scandal. There's a lot of political stuff going off. You know, there's so much in the 70s. That is something which, again, IFP need to tap into. Who you could get to write for that, I don't know. But, you know, to make it worthwhile, you've got to obviously capture the essence and the spirit and the beliefs and the attitudes of the 1970s, but then kind of do a little bit of Dan Brown and sort of work in the reality, you know, the facts into the fiction. You know, the 1970s, you know, you could even get William Boyd to come back, because when he did Solo, which was set in 1969, that was kind of almost left open for a follow-up, for a sequel. You need to get William Boyd to follow that on, and then bring us into the 70s and just get somebody else to do that. Now, back in the day, Ian Fleming Publications actually, they got John Pearson to write. Fleming, who'd written Fleming's biography, but he also written the authorised biography of James Bond. And IFP actually asked him if he'd be interested in writing a series of Bond novels throughout the 70s. He declined. also, there was an idea where there was going to get. So obviously, Kingsley Amis came along. He did Colonel's Son, which I do need to give that a read again. But that is considered by many fans to be the best continuation novel out there. Kingsley Amis came along. He did Colonel's Son, and IFP's idea was to get a series of authors and have them release the books under a pseudonym of Robert Markham, which Colonel's Son was published under. Again, that fell through. So, yeah, Bond and the 70s has never been taken. But technically speaking, you have got the comic strips by Jim McCluskey. Or no, Jim Lawrence. I think it might have been Jim Lawrence and John McCluskey who gave us a load of comic strips, stories, which was released in the Daily Express on a daily or weekly basis, serialised. They are now collected in volumes. That's an episode for itself. But yeah, people, hardcore enthusiasts, could probably, class Jim Lawrence being the author of the 1970s. But no, I think 1970s is a decade which has not been explored, and it needs to. And the only way you could make it work is what John Gardner did. When John Gardner did License Renewed, in an interview he just said, he kind of saw it as putting Bond to sleep in the 1960s and waking him up in the 80s. I think the only way you could do that is to make Bond timeless. I mean, yes, Fleming mentioned Bond's year of birth being 1924 or 1921, something. I don't either 1921 or 1924. But you've got to just not mention that. In Solo, set in 1969, Bond was celebrating his 45th birthday and bought himself a Jensen Interceptor as a present. So we know from then he's 45. You've got to kind of forget that and just keep bringing him through into the 70s and then weave him into the 80s. Now, the 80s and 90s, I mean, John Gardner, it's a hit. I mean, John Gardner didn't even want to do it, but somehow I think he was persuaded in doing it. Now, even though his titles are absolutely fantastic and some of his titles could be used for future Bond films, they are really proper solid titles. Some of his stories are hit and miss. Some are good, some aren't so good. What I find with John Gardner is he doesn't necessarily have an individual villain. A lot of his books, stories, usually organisations or groups or cults. And there's a lot of double, triple crossing going over, which kind of makes it complicated. But yeah, I mean, he did 14 novels and 2 novelisations. And then, after Gardner did, Benson came along. And he... I mean, admittedly, I'm not a massive fan of what he did at the time, but that's not his fault. He was under orders. Ian Premier Publications told him to, make the stories more contemporary, to make them more in fitting with the Brosnan films. So basically, as you read them, they are like novelizations. They are very cinematic. You could literally just imagine everything you read on page and it would work. The only criticism I will have of Benson is I don't know if he's fulfilling some sort of sexual fantasy, but his sex scenes and love scenes are a little bit dodgy. I mean, I think in The Facts of Death, Bond started having sex with a nurse in a sperm clinic. I mean, that's just screaming out porn, that is. I mean, doesn't really kind of settle too well with me. And it's a bit like in High Time to Kill, where he is up in the Himalayas, I think, in a tent with breathing apparatus on, making love, because, breathing apparatus on whilst on the job, that's, really kind of romantic. So yeah, kind of having them adapted to screen, I think you'll probably have a little bit of issues with that. But yeah, Benson gave us 5 novels and 3 novelisations. And then after he went, that's when IFP went back in time and introduced Charlie Higson. And of course, since then, we've had various other one-off authors. We've had Sebastian Faulks, who came in 2008 and gave us Devil May Care, which was to celebrate Fleming's centenary. Now, a lot of people kind of dislike that novel, but I actually enjoyed it. The only qualm I had about it was the villain shared the same Christian name as Dr. No, Julius. And I thought, well, that's not exactly original. So yeah, we had Sebastian Faulks come along. A few years later, we had Jeffrey Deaver come along. Now, I, to this day, have not read his book and I don't own it because the concept just does not appeal to me. It's literally, you know, okay, we had Daniel Craig, who was rebooting the cinematic Bond, but now we have Jeffrey Deaver rebooting the literature Bond, which I kind of think is just a little bit. And of course, now we've got First Light, which is kind of rebooting the video game Bond. The Jeffrey Deaver, it's, I think the synopsis was that, you know, his James Bond was born in 1979. He's served in the Navy or the Marines. He's served his time in the Afghan War in 2003. That, I mean, as soon as you mention the year of birth, I think that's not Fleming's Bond. And I know it's crazy because, you know, I mean, I think Raymond Benson once may have mentioned Bond's year of birth as being 1952 or 53, but I think that's because he was obviously trying to match Brosnan's Bond. But I don't know. I think for me, especially the literature Bond, I don't want to know his year of birth because it tends to pull me out. So yeah, I was a bit not 100% sold on that. And then William Boyd comes along and gives us Solo, which again I've got to revisit that because a lot of people prefer Solo to Devil May Care, where I was the other way around. Solo, I kind of got lost halfway through. So yeah, there is. So yeah, it's for some reason IFP have kind of gone back. I mean, obviously Horowitz, he did 3 novels kind of set within the Fleming timeline. He gave us Trigger Mortis, Forever and a Day, and A Mind to Kill, which I absolutely loved. You know, that I thought that was something that Fleming had written, written, because that just followed brilliantly from The Man with the Golden Gun. Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic with A Mind to Kill. Absolutely loved it. And I've always said that for the next Bond, or in a future Bond film, you should have the pre-title sequence as in The Man with the Golden Gun, where Bond is making an attempt on M's life, and then after that it should basically be pretty much a faithful adaptation of With a Mind to Kill, or Bought in the Modern Times. So yeah, Ian Fleming Publications, they seem to be focusing on backwards. I mean, even Raymond Benson's back with The Hook and the High. That's set in 1952, between the events of Casino Royale and Live and Let Die. So yeah, it's kind of, you know, so that's a kind of standalone, which I know people have been downloading the episodes and I know they've had trouble with that. I have got that pre-ordered in paperback in October, so I'm looking forward to kind of getting stuck in that. And I hope I enjoy them more than his continuation novels. And of course, you know, Charlie Higson did come back in 2023 with On His Majesty's Secret Service, which I've only just read. I read it a couple of months ago. Again, it was in a day. I just did it in one sitting. And I must say that with that, he kind of got it right, because we still knew it was Bond. He never mentioned it being, you know, his date of birth or year of birth. We knew it was Bond. It was timeless, you know, and the plot, it was a very political plot, probably the most political of Bond novels we've had. It was, you know, absolutely, you know, unfortunately, it represented today's society 100% accurate. There's no exaggeration on the shit we live into today, and that is what he, you know, wrote in this book. You know, that is what today's society is like, and he kind of totally got Bond, and I really hope that he will come back and give us, you know, a full-blown Bond novel, or several, a trilogy in fact, just in modern day. So yeah, I just felt like I needed to get this episode out there. It was also because a gentleman on the James Bond collectible books, Mr. Tony Jelly, he suggested something a while back about the past, future and present of Bond. I thought, you know what, that'll make a good episode in terms of the literature Bond, which is what this is. So yeah, that is, I believe, today's episode. So yeah, I've been looking forward to doing this because it's slightly different. I felt that the books aren't really ever talked about as much as the films. So yeah, it's slightly different, and yeah, I kind of think that, you know, give us, you know, some Bond stories set in the 1940s by Mr. Robert Harris, brilliant, and yeah, I mean Bond in the 70s, that I say, who you'd get to write that, I don't know, but I just think that's a decade which is yet to be explored. So potentially we've got, you know, a Bond novels covering nearly 100 years. You know, we've got young Bond in the 30s, you know, right through. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting that after 2003, 2002, we haven't had a Bond novel sort of properly in the present. It's probably because the present world's so fucked up. What can you do to rectify it or to write about it? So yeah, you know, after Raymond Benson, IFP kind of chose to go backwards, with the exception of Jeffrey Deaver, which I think that even became a failure because he was never asked back again. So I don't think that kind of worked. But yeah, you've got, you know, it kind of makes you wonder why they kind of decided to go backwards. It's probably easier. I don't know, maybe the literature Bond is somebody of the past. But the thing is also now, you've got so much spy thrillers out there. You know, I mean, you've obviously got Mick Herron's Slow Horses. That's a relatively new kind of thing. I think Lee Charlie does a few spy thriller things. So yeah, it's probably down to competition. You know, how can you make a modern day Bond fit into, you know, the literature sort of side. So yeah, I kind of, you know, really feel that we need the 1940s filling in and the 1970s, and to get either Charlie Higson or somebody else just to give us a few modern fairy tales, and even kind of probably bring Spectre back. You know, I mean, Dynamite Comics, they are doing it brilliantly. I think I might have mentioned them before. If you have not indulged into their series, you must, because what they have done have just been totally original stories. They've kind of brought back Spectre in such a unique and such an original way, really clever way, better than what they did with the Craig films. And they've even sort of dabbled a bit with Smersh again in modern day. So yeah, they ain't afraid to do that. But I would just like to see, you know, I mean, not all of us are massive graphic novel fans. I'm not a big graphic novel fan. I kind of find them difficult to read at times, but I only get them because of Bond. But I know there's a lot of people who would, you know, quite rightly so, would rather read, you know, a hardback book, you know, a proper novel. So there's still, you know, opportunity to kind of reinvent and bring in, or even adapt some of the Dynamite comics into novel format. So yeah, there is potential, but this is probably no doubt me wishful thinking. The chances of Ian Fleming Publications ever seeing this video is zilch. Whether or not they've actually ever thought about taking Bond to the 1940s or having one novel set to the 1970s, who knows? But yeah, I mean, you could even get him beyond a Lotus Esprit. In terms of this episode, I think I pretty much covered it. So I don't know what I'm going to talk about next week. I'm sure I'll find something. But otherwise, thanks for listening, and